The Galactic Council chamber roared with laughter. Delegates of 100 species sat in their grand elevated seats, watching the spectacle unfold before them. Some chittered, some hissed, and others made deep, guttural sounds of amusement. But the loudest among them was the king of the Drekath, an 8-foot-tall reptilian monarch draped in shimmering golden robes. His scaled lips curled into a grin as he gestured toward the human standing below. "This is your prize, human," the king declared, his voice thick with mockery. "The daughter I no longer have use for. May she bring you the fortune you deserve." The laughter swelled, filling the chamber like a tidal wave. The human, arms crossed, barely flinched. He had seen plenty of galactic theatrics before, but this was something new. An entire council entertained by a political handoff, one that clearly held more weight than it seemed. He glanced to the side, where the so-called unwanted daughter stood. She was silent, her expression unreadable beneath the ceremonial veil that covered half her face. Tall and regal, with violet-toned skin and piercing silver eyes, she didn't look like someone to be discarded. If anything, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been trained for something far greater than this humiliation. Yet here she was, handed off like a trinket. The human let out a slow breath. "And what exactly am I supposed to do with her?" His voice cut through the laughter, making a few delegates pause. The king bared his sharp teeth in a grin. "That is your problem now. Consider it a diplomatic gesture." Diplomatic gesture. Right. The human wasn't stupid. This was a game. A cruel one, maybe. But a game nonetheless. And if there was one thing humans had learned about the Galactic Council, it was that games always had stakes. The laughter in the chamber eventually died down as the king turned away, already done with the exchange. The human knew that whatever had just happened, it wasn't random. The Drekath were too calculating for that. The woman beside him remained still, watching, listening. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost indifferent. "You do not seem pleased by your reward." He snorted. "You're not a reward. You're leverage." Something flickered in her silver eyes. Amusement? Resentment? It was hard to tell. Then you understand more than they think. The council session moved on to other matters, but the human knew his real problem had only just begun. He had just inherited the king's unwanted daughter. And in a galaxy where power shifted like sand in a storm, nothing was ever given away for free. As they left the chamber, he cast her a sideways glance. "So what exactly did you do to get yourself exiled?" She smiled then, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "That is a very long story." The doors sealed shut behind them. Whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be simple. And it definitely wouldn't be safe. The corridor outside the council chamber was cold and quiet, a sharp contrast to the mocking voices that had filled the grand hall minutes ago. The human walked ahead, hands in his pockets, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that the Galactic Council had just played him for a fool, or the fact that he still had no idea why. The woman beside him walked with the same calm presence she had held inside the chamber. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even curious about where he was taking her. That unsettled him more than anything. "I assume you have a ship," she said. He didn't look at her. "You assume right. And I assume you have no intention of turning around and taking me back to my father." That made him stop. He turned, meeting her gaze. "Is that what you want?" For the first time, something flickered across her face, something unreadable, something too guarded to be an honest answer. "No." He studied her for a second longer, then started walking again. "Good. Because I don't take orders from overgrown lizards, no matter how many crowns they wear." She fell into step beside him. "Then that makes two of us." They didn't speak again until they reached the docking bay. His ship, a heavily modified freighter, sat at the far end, its worn hull marked with years of rough travel. It wasn't much, but it was his. And unlike the grand palaces and luxury cruisers of the council members, this one had no hidden doors, no spies lurking in the walls. She stopped at the bottom of the loading ramp, glancing up at the ship. "Functional." He smirked. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He motioned for her to board. She hesitated only for a second before stepping inside. The doors sealed behind them, and just like that, she was no longer a princess standing in a grand hall. She was a passenger on a ship she had no control over. He led her to the small central lounge, where a worn-out couch and a low table filled the space. The hum of the ship's systems was a steady background noise, comforting in a way the council's marble floors could never be. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "All right. Start talking." She sat on the couch, smoothing the fabric of her robes. "About what?" "About why your father handed you over like a bad trade deal." She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "Because I am a liability." He waited for more, but she offered nothing. He exhaled sharply. "You're going to have to give me more than that." She glanced at him, something almost amused in her expression. "Are you always this impatient?" "Only when I get the feeling I'm being dragged into something that's going to get me killed." Her lips curved into a slight smile. "Then you should have left me in that chamber." That wasn't an option. Silence stretched between them. He wasn't sure why he had said that, but it was true. Something about the way the council had laughed, the way the king had dismissed her, none of it sat right with him. He had been in the outer territories long enough to know when someone was being used as a pawn in a much bigger game. She finally spoke, her voice quieter this time. "My father is preparing for war." That caught his attention. She continued. "The Dracath have been expanding their territory for years. But now, the council is watching. If my father starts a full-scale war, the other empires will intervene. He needed a reason to prove he isn't a threat. So he gave them you." She nodded. "I was his strongest political piece. By offering me up, he made it seem like he was willing to negotiate. Willing to compromise. But he's not. No." He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Great. So I just got caught in the middle of a war before it even started." She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something real behind her calm exterior. "I was caught in it the moment I was born." Another silence. This one, heavier. He pushed off the wall. "Oh, right. Fine. You're a political sacrifice. But that still doesn't explain why you don't want to go back. You could have played along, waited for your father to need you again." Something in her jaw tightened. There are worse things than exile. She didn't say anything else, and for now, he didn't push. Instead, he turned toward the cockpit. "Strap in. We're leaving. Leaving." She stood but didn't move. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere far." She studied him, as if measuring the weight of his words. "Do you really think distance will keep us safe?" He flicked a few switches on the console, the engines rumbling to life. "I don't believe in safe." The ship lifted off, cutting through the artificial gravity of the docking bay and slipping into the void of space. Stars stretched beyond them, endless and cold. As they jumped into hyperspace, neither of them spoke, but they both knew the silence wouldn't last. Because somewhere, deep in the territories of the Dracath Empire, a war was already beginning. And whether they liked it or not, they were part of it now. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, steady and unchanging. The stars outside stretched into long, thin lines as they moved through hyperspace, but inside, neither of them spoke. He kept his eyes on the console, running checks, adjusting their trajectory. She sat in the co-pilot's chair, watching him. Not saying anything, just watching. After a while, he sighed and leaned back. "All right, enough with the staring." "What?" She tilted her head slightly. "I'm trying to understand you." He scoffed. "Good luck with that? You could have walked away back there." He shrugged. "Could have." She didn't break eye contact. "So why didn't you?" He didn't answer right away. He could have given her a dozen reasons. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was just the way the council had laughed, like they knew something he didn't. But none of those were the real reason. Instead, he just said, "Didn't feel right." Something flickered in her expression. Not quite approval. Not quite understanding, but something close. She leaned back in her seat. That makes you dangerous, you know? He smirked. I've been called worse. Their conversation was cut short by the warning chime of the ship's scanner. He frowned and flicked a switch, pulling up the readout. Something wrong? She asked. He narrowed his eyes. We've got a shadow. She leaned forward, looking at the screen. A pursuer? Looks like it. The signature was faint, but it was there. A small vessel, hanging just outside their scanner range. Not close enough to attack, not far enough to ignore. Just watching. She exhaled slowly. I assume you have weapons? He gave her a sideways glance. You assume right. Then why aren't you using them? Because I don't like shooting blind. He tapped a few buttons, running a deeper scan. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dealing with torpedoes. They're tracking us for a reason. Her expression darkened. Dracath? Could be. Could be counsel. Could be someone who just wants to collect a payday on a lost princess. She didn't react to the title. Then what do we do? He considered their options. Firing up the weapons would force a confrontation. Running would confirm they had something to hide. But neither of those sat right. He hated playing defense. So he did the opposite. Without warning, he cut the engines. The sudden shift sent a jolt through the ship, and she tensed as the stars outside returned to normal, hyperspace bleeding away into the quiet darkness of real space. The tracking vessel didn't react immediately, but then a tiny blip moving closer. She frowned. You're letting them catch us? He leaned back. I'm letting them show their hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the comm system crackled to life. A voice, distorted but unmistakably human, came through the speakers. Brave move, pilot. Most people run when they know they're being hunted. He tapped the console. Yeah, well, I'm not most people. The voice chuckled. No. No, you're not. She leaned in, lowering her voice. You recognize them? He shook his head slightly. Not yet. The voice continued. You're carrying precious cargo, pilot. And a lot of people are very interested in what happens to it. His grip on the controls tightened. If you've got something to say it. A pause. Then, she's worth more than you realize. The ship's sensors lit up. Another blip. Then another. Then another. 3 more vessels, closing in. He swore under his breath. Dracath? No. She shook her head. Something worse. Before he could ask, the first blast hit. The ship rocked violently, alarms blaring. Shields dropped to 70%. He didn't waste time asking questions. He slammed the throttle forward, engines roaring as they broke into a full-speed burn. The comm channel crackled again, but this time, the voice wasn't laughing. You should have just walked away, pilot. Blaster fire ripped past them, and the chase was on. The ship tore through space, engines burning hotter than they were ever meant to. The enemy vessels were right behind them, closing fast. He gritted his teeth, hands tight on the controls, pushing every ounce of power into their escape. The hull vibrated under the strain. One wrong move and they were done. She sat rigid beside him, eyes locked on the targeting display. They're trying to box us in. I know, he muttered. A warning alarm blared. The enemy ships were splitting into formation, moving in a coordinated pattern. Whoever they weren't amateurs. She tapped a button, pulling up data. They're herding us toward a dead zone. No trade routes, no nearby colonies. No one to call for help. He let out a sharp breath. So that's their game. Another blast rocked the ship. Shields at 40%. He veered hard left, but they matched his movements like a pack of hunters. Every exit, every maneuver cut off before he could complete it. It was no longer just a chase. It was a hunt. And they were the prey. She turned to him, voice tense. We need an opening. Now. He scanned the star map, mind racing. There's one option. She followed his gaze and immediately shook her head. No. That system is a graveyard. He smirked grimly. Exactly. He redirected all power to the engines, accelerating toward the sector marked as a no-go zone. A shattered region of space filled with the wreckage of 1,000 battles-forgotten warships, broken stations, and the remnants of fleets that had been erased from history. She gripped the console. You're insane. Probably. The first enemy ship hesitated. Then the second. The third continued pursuit, but not as aggressively. He could tell they were debating whether it was worth the risk. That hesitation was all he needed. The ship plunged into the debris field. Wreckage loomed around them, twisted metal and dead hulls drifting silently in the void. He maneuvered between them, threading the needle at impossible speeds. The enemy hesitated before finally following, but they weren't as fast. A loud clang echoed through the ship as a stray piece of debris scraped against the hull. Not much room for mistakes in here, she muttered. He was too focused to respond. He could see it their way out. A collapsed battleship, its massive frame split down the middle. A narrow gap barely large enough for them to squeeze through. If they made it, they'd have cover on the other side. If they didn't, well, it wouldn't matter. He pushed forward, engines screaming. The gap rushed toward them. The enemy ships were closing in. Too fast. Too close. She braced herself. We're not going to make it. He didn't slow down. He didn't flinch. At the last second, he rolled the ship, twisting through the narrow opening. A heartbeat later, one of the pursuing ships tried to follow, and slammed into wreckage, detonating on impact. The blast sent a shockwave through the debris field, forcing the remaining enemy ships to pull back. He used the chaos to dive further into the wreckage, vanishing into the shadows. For a long moment, there was silence. She exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. Did we lose them? The scanner was quiet. No active pursuit. No signs of movement. He allowed himself a small smirk. Looks like it. Then, a new signal appeared on the scanner. Not an enemy ship. Not wreckage. Something else. Something waiting. Her eyes widened as she read the data. That's impossible. He checked the readings himself. His stomach dropped. No, not impossible. Worse. They weren't alone in the graveyard. The signal pulsed steadily on the screen, too precise to be random debris, too controlled to be a drifting wreck. He narrowed his eyes, adjusting the scanner. It wasn't just there, it was moving. Slowly, deliberately. Watching. She leaned closer, her voice tight. It's not one of theirs. Different energy signature. He didn't reply. His grip tightened on the controls. This wasn't a patrol ship, wasn't a part of the fleet that had been hunting them. But that didn't make it any less dangerous. The wreckage around them was silent, the hollow remains of dead warships stretching in all directions. No comms chatter, no automated distress signals. Just the quiet hum of their own engines and the rhythmic blip of the unknown contact. Then it changed. The signal split. 1 became 2. Then 3. Then 5. His stomach twisted. That's not a coincidence. A deep, low vibration passed through the ship, more felt than heard. Something massive had stirred within the graveyard. The wreckage shifted subtly, pieces breaking away as if something underneath was pushing through. She shot him a glance. Tell me you're seeing this. He was. And he didn't like what he was seeing. One of the larger derelicts ahead, a once mighty battleship, long dead, began to move. Not from inertia. Not from impact. It was rising. Lights flickered along its fractured hull. Not standard navigation beacons, not emergency strobes, something else. A pattern. A message. She whispered. That ship was dead. It should have been. It was. Until now. His pulse pounded in his ears. He tapped into the long-range scanner, forcing a deeper scan. The readings made no sense. The wreck had no power core, no functioning drive system. And yet, it was active. The first pulse came a second later. Not a weapon. Not a transmission. Something deeper. A low, reverberating frequency that sent chills down his spine. Then, the second. The wreckage around them shifted again. Smaller pieces breaking free. Movement in the shadows. Then he understood. They weren't alone in the graveyard because something had survived here. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. A cold weight settled in his gut. He reached for the throttle. "We need to go. Now." She didn't argue. The engines roared as he powered up the drive, pushing forward, away from the shifting wreck. The signal flared again. And this time, it answered back. Not in a way they could hear. Not a transmission in any known language. The derelict battleship unleashed another pulse, and the wreckage around it reacted. Debris moved in ways it shouldn't. Dead ships powered up with no fuel. The remnants of long-forgotten war machines turned their empty hulls toward them. Not random. Not coincidence. A response. She inhaled sharply. They're waking up. He didn't wait to find out what that meant. He hit the engines, the ship tearing forward. Wreckage scraped past them as they weaved through the shifting battlefield. The scanner flared with movement, dozens of signals, all activating at once. The graveyard was no longer just a resting place. It was something else. And now it knew they were here. The ship shuddered violently as the wreckage around them came alive. What had once been lifeless, broken hulls now moved with eerie purpose, shifting and closing in as if drawn by an unseen force. The scanners screamed warnings, energy signatures spiking from multiple directions, power sources flickering to life inside ships that had been dead for decades. He gritted his teeth, hands flying over the controls. "Brace yourself!" The engines roared as he forced the ship into a sharp dive, barely avoiding a jagged fragment of twisted metal. Behind them, one of the derelict battleships ignited with unnatural energy, its gutted insides pulsing like the heartbeat of something awakening from a long slumber. She clung to the console, scanning the data. "They're forming a perimeter. They don't want us to leave." He didn't need to be told twice. The wrecks weren't just drifting randomly anymore. They were moving tactically, cutting off their escape routes, pushing them toward the center of the graveyard. A deep pulse rippled through space again, vibrating through the hull. This time, it wasn't just a signal. It was a command. One of the derelicts ahead twisted violently, breaking apart from the inside. Someone stepped out of its shattered remains. A figure, humanoid but wrong in all the ways that mattered. Its armor was old, its design from an era long before the Galactic Council even existed. And yet, it was pristine, untouched by time. The faceplate was smooth, featureless, reflecting only the dim glow of distant stars. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, watching them. Then it raised an arm. A surge of energy erupted from its palm, striking their ship with brutal force. The shields flared under the impact, alarms screaming in protest. The lights flickered. Systems struggled to stay online. "Shields at 30%, she shouted, fingers flying over the controls. He spun the ship hard, breaking into a desperate run through the debris field. More of them were emerging now, silent, armored figures stepping from ruined ships, standing atop broken hulls, watching as if waiting for something. Then the comms crackled to life. Not with words, not with voices, with memories. Flashes of ancient battles surged through his mind, ships burning, entire fleets vanishing into nothingness. He saw soldiers, just like the ones now rising before them, standing in formation as a towering figure loomed above them. Not a king. Not an emperor. Something worse. Something that had never left. The realization hit him like a hammer. "These aren't ghosts," he whispered. "They're waiting." She looked at him, confusion and fear in her eyes. Waiting for what? A shadow passed over them. Above, the largest wreck, the battleship that had first moved, had fully reactivated. Its colossal frame loomed, its long dead cannons humming with power. The final pulse came. A command. An awakening. And the graveyard answered. One by one, the ancient warriors turned toward them, their featureless masks reflecting the chaos unfolding. Then, as one, they moved. Not aimlessly, not like mindless machines. With purpose. He barely had time to react before the first blast rocked the ship. Systems faltered. The engines sputtered. They were being pulled in, dragged toward the heart of whatever had been buried here. She gripped his arm. If we don't break free now. Another impact. Harder. The ship groaned, metal screaming under pressure. And then, in the space between moments, something changed. The darkness beyond the wreckage split. A new presence arrived. And it wasn't here to save them. The ship lurched, its systems barely holding together as the battlefield shifted around them. The presence that had arrived was unlike the silent warriors. It carried no echoes of the past, no remnants of the long-dead war. This was something new. A single massive vessel descended through the wreckage, its hull untouched by time or decay. It moved with terrifying precision, bypassing the floating debris as if reality itself bent around it. The ancient warriors, who had been so intent on their destruction, suddenly stopped. Not in hesitation, but in obedience. A deep, resonant tone filled the air, vibrating through the ship's failing systems. It wasn't a language, but a command. The figures surrounding them turned, their helmets tilting upward in acknowledgement. Then, as if an unseen hand had rewritten the battle script, they disengaged. One by one, the warriors stepped back into the shadows of the ruined vessels they had emerged from. The energy signatures faded. The wreckage stilled. And then the massive ship was gone. He exhaled, his grip loosening on the controls. The scanners confirmed it. Whatever force had been watching, testing, had chosen to let them live. She checked the readings, her voice still unsteady. Why did they stop? He shook his head, eyes scanning the graveyard around them. They weren't here for us. The realization settled between them like a weight. This place hadn't been a battlefield. It had been a prison. A containment field for something too dangerous to be left unchecked. And now, whatever had held them here had been satisfied. Or worse, replaced. With systems barely functional, they pulled away from the wreckage, leaving behind the silent sentinels and their forgotten war. The stars stretched before them, cold and indifferent. She exhaled, tension still hanging in her voice. Do we tell the council what we found? He looked out at the endless void, at the graveyard that had nearly become theirs. He thought of the warriors, the presence that had arrived, the way history had repeated itself in an endless cycle. No, he said finally. Some things are better left buried. With that, he engaged the thrusters and they disappeared into the black, leaving behind the echoes of a war that had never truly ended.